5,000 years ago, before the pyramids had finished casting their first long shadows, before the idea of history itself had a name, people pressed symbols into wet clay and claimed the world had already ended once. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. They wrote that the sky broke open, the rivers swallowed cities whole, and the gods themselves panicked at what they had unleashed. These were not poets imagining catastrophe centuries later. These were accountants, engineers, priests, and city planners recording memories they believed were inherited, not invented. Why would the earliest writers insist humanity was created as a solution to a labor crisis among gods? Why do these texts describe divine beings who argue, regret, make mistakes, and depend on human offerings to survive? Why does the oldest flood story on Earth present the gods not as all-knowing judges, but as frightened figures huddling at the edge of heaven? Why does civilization, in its own birthplace, begin not with enlightenment, but with servitude, noise, and rebellion? Why do the foundations of law, kingship, astronomy, and writing emerge immediately after a story of near total annihilation? And most unsettling of all, why do these accounts feel less like myth-making and more like explanations offered by people trying to make sense of a world already ancient to them? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The land between the rivers did not look like a cradle when humans first arrived. It was flat, exposed, and unforgiving. A wide stretch of mud and dust where the sun pressed down without mercy. The Tigris and the Euphrates cut through this landscape like living veins, bringing both life and threat in equal measure. Unlike the Nile, which rose and fell with a rhythm farmers could predict, these rivers behaved like temperamental gods themselves. One year they nourished the fields, the next they tore them apart, flooding without warning, shifting their courses, abandoning settlements that had trusted them too completely. To live here required constant attention, collective effort, and an acceptance that survival depended on forces beyond human control. It was in this environment that people first began to settle permanently, not as wandering herders, but as builders of cities. Archaeology places the earliest villages in southern Mesopotamia around the 6th millennium BCE, small clusters of homes clinging to waterways, experimenting with irrigation, learning through failure how to guide water without unleashing destruction. Over generations, these experiments hardened into knowledge. Canals were dug, levees raised, fields mapped with careful precision. This was not the work of a single lifetime, but of accumulated memory, passed down through practice long before it was written. By the 4th millennium BCE, something unprecedented appeared. Cities emerged, dense and complex, housing tens of thousands of people in an age when most of humanity still lived in scattered villages. Uruk became the most striking example. Spreading over miles of land, its skyline punctuated by massive stepped structures built from mud brick, each level rising toward the sky. These were ziggurats, tiered temple platforms that functioned as far more than religious monuments. They were storehouses, administrative centers, and symbolic bridges between earth and heaven. From their heights, priests observed the movement of stars, tracked seasons, and aligned ritual time with celestial patterns. The people who built these cities did not see themselves as pioneers, inventing civilization from nothing. According to their own records, they believed cities were gifts, established first by the gods and then maintained by humans. Eridu, remembered as the first city, was said to have been founded directly by divine hands. This belief mattered. It framed human labor not as innovation, but as continuation, the maintenance of an order already laid down. To neglect that order was to invite disaster, flood, famine, or collapse. Writing emerged from this mindset, not as literature, but as control. The earliest clay tablets from Uruk record transactions, measures of barley, counts of livestock, distributions of labor. Each mark pressed into clay represented accountability. Someone owed something. Someone delivered something. Someone failed. Over time, these pictorial marks evolved into cuneiform, a system of wedge-shaped impressions capable of expressing increasingly abstract ideas. What began as bookkeeping grew into a tool for law, mathematics, astronomy, and eventually myth. The scribes who mastered this system occupied a powerful position. They were trained from childhood in tablet houses, memorizing hundreds of signs, copying texts until muscle memory replaced thought. Literacy was rare and sacred. To write was to preserve order against chaos, to fix reality in a form that could outlast memory. When myths were finally written down centuries after they were first spoken, they carried this same weight. These were not stories told for amusement. They were explanations for why the world functioned as it did and why humans occupied their particular place within it. At the center of these explanations stood the Anunnaki. The term did not refer to a single group with a fixed role, but to a shifting category of powerful divine beings whose authority shaped the cosmos. Sometimes the word meant the great gods collectively, sometimes judges of the underworld, sometimes deities who dwelled on earth rather than in the sky. What remained consistent was their status. They were not distant abstractions. They acted, argued, planned, and intervened. They ate offerings, inhabited temples, and depended on human ritual to sustain their presence in the world. The Sumerian pantheon reflected the society that worshipped it. Authority was hierarchical. At the top stood Anu, the sky itself, vast and remote, rarely involved in daily affairs. Power on the ground belonged to Enlil, lord of air and storms, whose word determined the fate of cities and kings. He embodied order, discipline, and the ruthless maintenance of structure. Alongside him stood Enki, god of fresh water and wisdom, associated with the underground reservoir believed to feed all rivers and springs. Where Enlil enforced, Enki adapted. Where Enlil punished, Enki intervened. This tension mattered because it mirrored human experience. Civilization required rules, but survival often depended on flexibility. Too much order crushed life. Too much freedom dissolved it. The myths did not resolve this conflict cleanly. Instead, they allowed it to play out repeatedly through divine argument and compromise. Humans were caught within that dynamic, shaped by it, sometimes protected by it, sometimes destroyed by it. The gods were not portrayed as perfect. They grew angry, fearful, regretful. When humans multiplied and their activity filled the land with noise, it was Enlil who saw a threat to cosmic balance. The word noise likely meant more than sound. It suggested disruption, independence, a growing human presence that could no longer be ignored. The response was not moral judgment, but population control. Plagues, droughts, famine. Each attempt to reduce humanity was met by Enki's quiet resistance, teaching humans how to survive divine punishment without directly defying divine authority. These stories suggest an early understanding of catastrophe as cyclical rather than final. Disaster was not the end of the world, but a correction, often excessive, sometimes regretted. The flood, when it came, was the ultimate correction. Even the gods recoiled from it, horrified by the consequences of their own decision. That detail is critical. It reveals a world view in which power does not guarantee wisdom and authority does not eliminate error. After the waters receded, the relationship between gods and humans changed. The destruction had revealed an uncomfortable truth. The gods needed humans. Without offerings, temples fell silent. Without labor, the land returned to wilderness. Civilization itself was a fragile agreement between divine intention and human effort. From that moment forward, limits were imposed, lifespans shortened, birth became dangerous, population was constrained, order was restored, but at a cost written into the human condition. Kingship emerged within this framework as mediation. Kings were not gods, though some claimed divine ancestry. They were administrators of order, responsible for maintaining canals, enforcing laws, appeasing gods, and protecting cities. Their authority was sacred but conditional. A king who failed invited divine withdrawal, famine, invasion, or flood. This belief system bound political power to cosmic responsibility, making governance not merely human ambition, but ritual obligation. By the time Sumerian civilization reached its height, the patterns established by these myths were embedded in daily life. Every field plowed echoed the labor once assigned to divine beings. Every tablet written extended memory beyond death. Every city wall marked a boundary between order and chaos. What happened after the Anunnaki came, according to these texts, was not a single event, but a process. Civilization was not a gift handed down complete. It was an ongoing negotiation, fragile, costly, and endlessly repeated, carried forward by humans who believed they were maintaining a world that had already nearly been lost once. Clay remembers things flesh cannot. Long after voices fade and cities sink back into dust, the tablets remain, small enough to fit in the hand, heavy enough to survive fire, flood, and burial. Each one is a frozen moment of intention, a human effort to hold something still in a world that constantly shifts. When the Sumerians began pressing signs into clay, they were not trying to preserve poetry or philosophy. They were trying to prevent loss. Grain disappears, livestock wanders, promises dissolve. Writing emerged as a defense against forgetting, and in doing so, it reshaped how reality itself was understood. The earliest tablets read like inventories of survival, measures of barley listed next to names, tallies of sheep marked by simple wedges. These marks were not decorative. They were enforceable. A tablet could be held up as proof. Someone had given, someone had received, someone was accountable. Over time, these records accumulated into archives stored in temples and palaces, spaces that functioned as both sacred centers and administrative hubs. The temple was not only where gods were honored, but where the city was managed. Religion and bureaucracy were not separate domains. They were different expressions of the same need for order. As writing grew more complex, so did the ideas it could carry. Symbols that once stood only for objects began to represent sounds, actions, and abstractions. Law entered the clay. Contracts defined marriage, adoption, and inheritance. Penalties were fixed. Disputes could be judged against precedent rather than memory. This shift mattered deeply. Justice became something external, something written, less dependent on power alone. To violate a law was no longer just to offend a ruler, but to disrupt an order believed to be sanctioned by the gods. Time itself was reorganized through this system. Observations of the moon and stars were recorded systematically, not as superstition, but as pattern recognition. Priests tracked celestial movements from temple platforms, noting how the moon waxed and waned, how certain stars returned to the same place each year. These patterns were linked to agricultural cycles, festival calendars, and omens. Astronomy was not separate from theology. The sky was a text written by divine hands, and humans learned to read it slowly, generation by generation. Within this expanding framework of knowledge, myths took on a new role. Once committed to writing, they became fixed points of reference, stories that could be copied, compared, and debated. The creation of humanity, the rebellion of divine laborers, the flood, the re-establishment of order. These were not casual tales. They explained why work was hard, why death was inevitable, why suffering existed alongside prosperity. They offered coherence in a world where disaster could strike without warning. One of the most revealing aspects of these myths is their refusal to idealize power. The gods are not distant embodiments of perfection. They are deeply flawed, divided, and reactive. When the lesser gods rebel against endless labor, their uprising is portrayed not as evil, but as understandable exhaustion. When Enlil responds with fear and rage, it exposes the fragility of authority that relies solely on control. The solution proposed by Enki, the creation of humans to absorb the burden of labor, is pragmatic rather than compassionate. Humanity is born not from love, but from necessity. This origin story shaped how people understood themselves. To be human was to work, to maintain systems that kept chaos at bay. Irrigation canals did not dig themselves. Fields did not water themselves. Cities did not sustain themselves. Labor was not punishment, but purpose. Yet, embedded in this purpose was tension. Humans were created to serve, but they were also given intelligence, creativity, and fertility. They grew beyond their assigned role. They became loud, numerous, and unpredictable. The very traits that made civilization possible also threatened divine control. The repeated attempts to reduce the human population through plague and famine reveal a worldview in which catastrophe is corrective rather than moral. Humans are not destroyed because they are evil, but because they are excessive. Balance, not virtue, is the priority. This perspective differs sharply from later moral frameworks that emphasize sin and righteousness. In the Sumerian imagination, the universe is governed by thresholds. When something grows too large, too noisy, too disruptive, it must be reduced. The flood stands apart because it exceeds correction and becomes annihilation. Its scale horrifies even the gods who ordered it. The image of divine beings cowering, starving, and regretting their decision undermines any notion of omnipotence. It suggests a universe governed by power without foresight, authority without restraint. When the flood ends and a single human family survives, the gods recognize their dependence. Worship is not optional. Sacrifice is not symbolic. Without human offerings, the gods weaken. The relationship between divine and human becomes reciprocal, though still unequal. This shift has profound consequences. Limits are imposed on human life. Mortality accelerates. Birth becomes dangerous. Not all children survive. Some women are barred from motherhood through ritual roles. These measures are not presented as cruelty, but as management, a grim acknowledgement that unchecked growth leads to catastrophe. The human condition is permanently altered. Suffering becomes normalized, woven into the structure of existence. What emerges after the flood is not a return to innocence, but a restructured world. Kingship is formalized as a divine institution, described as descending from heaven to specific cities. This language does not mean kings fell from the sky. It means authority was conceptualized as external, granted rather than seized. A king ruled because the gods allowed it, and that permission could be withdrawn. The city prospered when cosmic order aligned with human governance. It collapsed when that alignment failed. Cities became living organisms within this worldview. Each had a patron deity whose favor determined its fate. Wars between cities were understood as conflicts between gods expressed through human armies. Victory signaled divine approval. Defeat indicated withdrawal or punishment. This interpretation did not reduce violence, but it gave it meaning. History became readable as divine commentary on human behavior. Within daily life, these beliefs shaped everything from architecture to family structure. Homes were built around courtyards, private spaces shielded from the street, reflecting a concern with order and boundaries. Household gods received daily offerings, reinforcing the idea that divine presence was immediate, domestic, and constant. Children learned trades early, absorbing skills through repetition rather than instruction manuals. Education for scribes was harsh and disciplined, involving copying texts until errors disappeared. Knowledge was not meant to innovate freely, but to preserve continuity. Yet innovation happened anyway. Mathematical systems based on 60 allowed complex calculations. Legal codes standardized justice. Literature explored grief, friendship, and the search for meaning. The Epic of Gilgamesh would later crystallize these themes, but its roots lie in earlier Sumerian reflections on power and mortality. The realization that even kings die, that strength fades, that legacy matters more than longevity, emerges from this cultural soil. What makes this civilization remarkable is not that it believed in gods who came before humans, but that it wrestled openly with the consequences of that belief. The texts do not hide uncertainty. They record debate, contradiction, regret. They preserve a worldview in motion, one that recognizes both the necessity and the danger of order. After the Anunnaki established their dominion, according to these records, humanity did not simply obey. It adapted, endured, and gradually transformed a system built to control it into a civilization capable of remembering itself. When the floodwaters withdrew and the land re-emerged, the world did not reset to emptiness. It returned scarred, altered, and heavy with memory. The soil carried the residue of destruction, layers of silt left behind by receding water, burying old foundations and sealing away what had existed before. Archaeologists would later find these flood layers, thick bands of clay separating earlier settlements from those built afterward, silent evidence that catastrophe had interrupted continuity. For the people who lived through or inherited stories of this rupture, Rebuilding was not simply construction. It was restoration of balance in a world that had proven it could be erased. The survivors did not scatter randomly. They returned to the rivers, to the same unpredictable sources of life and ruin. Agriculture resumed because it had to. Without it, nothing else could follow. Canals were reopened, fields reclaimed, embankments repaired. These acts were practical, but they were also ritual. To guide water again was to demonstrate that humans had not been abandoned. Each successful harvest confirmed that the gods still allowed order to exist. Cities reformed with greater intention. The post-flood world emphasized hierarchy, boundaries, and clear roles. Where earlier communities may have grown organically, later cities were planned more deliberately. Streets narrowed to control movement. Walls rose higher, not just as defenses against enemies, but as statements of separation between chaos and civilization. Inside these walls, life was structured around institutions that mediated between human effort and divine will. The temple stood at the center of this structure. It was the house of the city's patron god, but it was also its warehouse, its archive, its employer. Grain flowed into temple storehouses after harvest. Wool, oil, and livestock were tallied, redistributed, and recorded. Workers received rations as wages, measured in barley and beer. This system did not erase inequality, but it made survival predictable. The temple absorbed surplus in good years and released it in bad ones, buffering the population against the river's volatility. The belief that gods physically inhabited their statues intensified this centralization. Divine images were not symbolic representations. They were treated as living presences. Each morning, priests washed, dressed, and fed the statues as if tending to a noble household member. Music was played. Incense burned. Silence and precision governed the rituals. To neglect these duties was to risk divine displeasure, which could manifest as drought, disease, or military defeat. Creating a god's statue was itself an act of controlled transformation. Craftsmen shaped wood and metal, inlaid precious stones, and performed rituals meant to invite divine essence into the object. Once completed, the statue was the god. Damaging it was an act of violence. Capturing it during war was equivalent to capturing the deity itself. This belief explains why conquering armies carried off statues from defeated cities. Power was demonstrated not only by territory gained, but by gods taken. Kings operated within this sacred economy. Their palaces stood near temples, not above them. A king ruled as the god's representative, tasked with maintaining justice, organizing labor, and leading in war. His legitimacy depended on success. A failed harvest or military defeat could be interpreted as divine disapproval. Kings recorded their deeds on stone and clay, framing victories as signs of favor and building projects as acts of devotion. These inscriptions were less about personal glory than about reinforcing the cosmic order. The legal system expanded under this framework. Laws were inscribed publicly, visible to those who could read and authoritative even to those who could not. The famous codes that would later emerge, such as those attributed to Hammurabi, had earlier precedents in Sumerian tradition. They regulated trade, marriage, inheritance, injury, and theft. Punishments were harsh, but they were standardized. Justice was no longer entirely personal or arbitrary. It followed written form. This shift altered how individuals understood themselves. A person was not only a member of a family or clan, but a subject of a city governed by laws believed to reflect divine will. Rights and obligations were defined. Contracts bound individuals beyond personal trust. Even time was regulated. Calendars fixed festival dates. Work cycles aligned with religious observance. Life unfolded according to schedules set by both celestial movements and administrative necessity. Yet beneath this order ran a current of anxiety. The flood was never forgotten. Lamentation texts mourn destroyed cities, describing streets filled with silence, temples abandoned, gods turned away. These were not abstract tragedies. They were warnings. The gods could withdraw again. Civilization was conditional. Prosperity required constant maintenance, ritual precision, and obedience to limits. This anxiety fueled intellectual effort. Scribes copied ancient texts repeatedly, preserving older forms of language even as spoken speech evolved. Sumerian itself became a learned language, no longer spoken daily, but retained for ritual and scholarship, much like Latin in later European history. Mastery of these texts connected scribes to a revered past and reinforced continuity across generations. Mythology adapted alongside political change. As new peoples entered Mesopotamia, bringing new languages and customs, the old gods were not discarded, but reinterpreted. Names shifted, attributes merged, stories evolved. The Anunnaki remained, but their roles adjusted to reflect new power structures. The core ideas persisted: divine hierarchy, human labor, cosmic balance, and the ever-present risk of collapse. The flood narrative was retold in multiple forms, each emphasizing different lessons. In some versions, obedience and piety are central. In others, cleverness and preparation matter more. The survivor is not saved because he is morally superior, but because he listens, acts decisively, and respects knowledge. Wisdom, not purity, ensures survival. This emphasis reflects a culture that valued competence and foresight in an unpredictable environment. Daily life within this world was demanding. Men labored in fields, workshops, and construction sites. Women managed households, brewed beer, wove textiles, and sometimes served as priestesses or administrators. Children contributed early, learning through participation rather than formal instruction. Life expectancy was short. Disease was common. Infant mortality was high. Death was not postponed to old age, but woven into ordinary experience. The afterlife offered little comfort. The dead descended to a shadowy realm ruled by a stern goddess, where existence continued as a diminished echo of life, sustained by offerings from the living. There was no reward for virtue, no punishment for vice beyond what occurred on earth. This belief sharpened the focus on present life. Meaning had to be created here through work, relationships, and legacy. Literature reflected this realism. Poems and proverbs advised moderation, warned against arrogance, and acknowledged the limits of human control. The gods could be appealed to, but not bargained with reliably. Fate could be influenced, but never mastered. This perspective did not breed despair so much as sobriety. It encouraged diligence, humility, and respect for systems larger than any individual. By the time later empires rose over the ruins of earlier cities, the framework established after the flood remained intact. New rulers inherited old temples, old myths, old anxieties. They built upon foundations laid by people who believed they were rebuilding a world once nearly destroyed. What endured was not a specific dynasty or language, but a pattern of thought. that civilization exists in tension with chaos, that order must be constantly renewed, and that memory, preserved in clay and ritual, is the only defense against forgetting how close the world once came to ending. As centuries passed, the memory of divine catastrophe did not fade into abstraction. It hardened into routine. Civilization in Mesopotamia was not driven by optimism, but by vigilance, an understanding that order survived only through constant attention. The rhythms of daily life were shaped by this awareness. Every action, from sowing grain to reciting hymns, carried the implicit goal of preventing collapse. To exist was to participate in maintenance. The cities grew larger, denser, and more specialized. Trade routes extended far beyond the river plains, reaching mountains and coastlines where resources unavailable in Mesopotamia could be acquired. Lapis lazuli traveled from distant highlands, its deep blue sheen reserved for gods and kings. Cedar wood arrived from forests hundreds of miles away, used to roof temples and palaces. Copper and tin moved along river and land routes, enabling the production of bronze tools and weapons. These materials transformed cities into hubs of exchange, tying survival to networks of trust and obligation beyond any single region. Merchants operated within the same divine framework as farmers and priests. Contracts were sworn before gods, sealed in clay, witnessed by scribes. Trade was risky, subject to theft, storm, and political instability. But it was also sacred. To cheat was not only to break a deal, but to invite divine retribution. The gods watched scales and measures. Fair exchange was part of cosmic order. This expansion intensified social stratification. Wealth concentrated in temples and palaces, while laborers lived closer to subsistence. Slavery existed, though it was not always permanent or racially defined. Debt could reduce a person to servitude. Prisoners of war could be forced into labor. Yet even slaves had legal status, protections defined in law. The system was harsh, but it was structured. Chaos was the greater fear. The priesthood gained increasing influence as interpreters of divine will. Omens were catalogued meticulously. A malformed animal, an eclipse, an unusual dream, the pattern of smoke from a sacrifice, all were recorded and compared against precedent. These signs were not viewed as random. They were messages embedded in reality itself, requiring trained readers to decode. Divination became a science of correlation, less about prophecy than pattern recognition. Astrology emerged from this impulse. The movement of planets was tracked against historical events. If a king died under a certain configuration of stars, that alignment was noted. If famine followed another, it too was recorded. Over generations, a vast database of celestial observation accumulated. The sky became a map of potential outcomes, not fixed destiny but probabilistic warning. Human action still mattered, but awareness offered advantage. This approach to knowledge extended into medicine. Illness was understood as both physical and spiritual imbalance. Treatments combined herbal remedies with incantations. A fever might be treated with poultices and prayers alike. Neither alone was sufficient. The body and the unseen world were intertwined. Healing required addressing both. Education for scribes reflected the seriousness of this worldview. Students copied long lexical lists, legal formulas, and hymns repeatedly. Errors were punished. Precision mattered because mistakes had consequences. A miscopied contract could cost someone their livelihood. A flawed ritual text could anger a god. Writing was not expressive freedom, it was responsibility. Despite this rigidity, creativity flourished. Literature explored emotional depth with striking honesty. Laments described grief with raw intensity. Cities personified as widows mourning their dead. Love poetry celebrated desire without shame. Wisdom texts offered pragmatic advice, warning that wealth was unstable and power fleeting. These works did not deny suffering. They acknowledged it as a fundamental feature of existence. The gods themselves remained complex figures. Enlil continued to represent authority and discipline, his decisions final even when destructive. Enki embodied ingenuity, his interventions subtle and indirect. Inanna, goddess of love and war, became increasingly prominent, reflecting the volatile mix of fertility and violence that characterized urban life. She was not nurturing in the maternal sense. She was ambitious, seductive, and ruthless, a force that could elevate a city or destroy it. Her myths often centered on boundary crossing. She descended into the underworld, stripped of her powers one by one, killed and revived through Enki's intervention. This story mirrored the seasonal cycle of vegetation, but it also reflected political reality. Cities rose and fell. Power was never secure. Even gods could be diminished. As political power shifted from Sumerian-speaking rulers to Akkadian kings, the mythological framework adapted. The Akkadian language spread as a spoken tongue, while Sumerian persisted as a sacred and scholarly language. Gods acquired new names, but their functions remained recognizable. Enki became Ea. Inanna became Ishtar. The continuity of belief masked the reality of conquest and cultural blending. Imperial ambition reshaped the relationship between gods and kings. Rulers like Sargon of Akkad presented themselves as chosen instruments of divine will, conquerors whose victories proved the favor of the gods. Their inscriptions emphasized universality, claiming rule over the 4 quarters of the world. This language was symbolic, expressing totality rather than geography. To rule everything was to embody order itself. Yet empire introduced new fragilities. Larger territories required more complex administration. Communication slowed. Rebellions multiplied. The irrigation systems that sustained cities demanded constant labor. When political instability disrupted maintenance, canals silted up. Fields became saline. Agricultural yields declined. Environmental strain compounded human conflict. The gods were blamed when things went wrong, but so were kings. Lamentations describe divine abandonment, temples stripped of presence, cities left to ruin. These texts were not merely religious. They were political critiques framed in cosmic language. A failed ruler was one who had lost divine favor, whether through arrogance, neglect, or misfortune. Through all this, the Anunnaki remained the conceptual foundation. They were not distant creators who withdrew after setting the world in motion. They were active participants whose decisions shaped history. Their conflicts mirrored human struggles. Their mistakes justified human suffering. Their need for worship validated human importance. What emerged from this worldview was not blind obedience, but conditional loyalty. Humans served the gods because service maintained order. The gods were honored because honor sustained the system. When the system failed, doubt emerged, expressed through lament rather than rebellion. Civilization endured not because it promised happiness, but because it offered continuity in a world where nothing else was guaranteed. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian civilization had weathered floods, invasions, and internal collapse, yet its core assumptions remained intact. The belief that the world had once nearly ended and could again shaped every institution. After the Anunnaki imposed structure on chaos, humanity learned to live within that structure by accepting its fragility. Order was never permanent. It was a task, renewed daily, written in clay, enforced by ritual, and remembered precisely because forgetting had once almost erased everything. Power in Mesopotamia was never abstract. It was visible, audible, and heavy, carried in the sound of marching feet, the weight of tribute, the smoke rising from altars. As cities expanded and rivalries intensified, warfare became a defining feature of life after the Anunnaki's order had settled into permanence. Conflict was not viewed as a breakdown of civilization, but as one of its expected pressures, a force that tested whether divine favor still rested upon a city and its ruler. War followed ritual as much as strategy. Before armies moved, priests consulted omens, examining the livers of sacrificed animals, reading patterns believed to mirror the intentions of the gods. A malformed lobe or unusual vein could delay a campaign or doom it before it began. Victory was never attributed solely to human skill. It was proof that a city's patron deity had prevailed over another's. Defeat signaled abandonment, punishment, or the temporary withdrawal of divine support. Kings presented themselves as shepherds, a metaphor drawn from pastoral life, suggesting guidance rather than tyranny. In reality, their authority depended on coercion and organization. Armies required food, weapons, and discipline. Soldiers were drawn from the citizenry, supplemented by mercenaries and conscripts. Bronze weapons gave an advantage to those who controlled trade routes supplying copper and tin. Siege warfare became increasingly sophisticated, with battering rams, ramps, and coordinated assaults against city walls. The violence left marks not only on bodies, but on memory. Cities destroyed in war were mourned in elaborate laments, texts that describe temples stripped bare, streets choked with silence, gods carried away into exile. These compositions did not celebrate heroism. They recorded loss. A fallen city was portrayed as a living being abandoned by its divine protector, its fate serving as a warning to others. Prosperity could vanish as quickly as floodwater receded. The Assyrians would later be known for their brutality, but even earlier Sumerian and Akkadian rulers understood terror as a tool of order. Public executions, mass deportations, and displays of defeated enemies were meant to discourage rebellion. These acts were framed as divinely sanctioned justice rather than cruelty. The gods demanded stability. Human suffering was collateral, regrettable but necessary. Despite this harshness, the concept of justice continued to evolve. Law codes emphasized proportional punishment, distinguishing between intentional harm and accident, between social classes, between citizens and slaves. These distinctions reflected inequality, but they also demonstrated an attempt to regulate violence rather than allow it to spiral unchecked. Revenge was constrained by written precedent. Economic life adapted to the pressures of war and administration. Large-scale projects required coordination beyond individual households. Canals were dug and maintained by organized labor forces directed by temples or palaces. These projects expanded agricultural capacity, but also deepened dependence on central authority. Failure to comply could mean loss of rations, property, or freedom. Debt became a powerful mechanism of control. Poor harvests forced families to borrow grain or silver. Inability to repay could result in temporary servitude or the loss of land. Kings occasionally declared debt amnesties, canceling obligations to restore social balance. These proclamations were not purely altruistic. They prevented unrest and ensured a stable labor base. Mercy, when granted, served order. Religion continued to justify and moderate these systems. Festivals punctuated the year, moments when normal hierarchies were symbolically inverted or suspended. During certain rites, kings were stripped of insignia and humbled before gods, acknowledging that their power was conditional. These rituals reinforced the idea that no human authority was absolute, even when it appeared so in daily life. The most elaborate of these festivals involved reenactments of cosmic creation, reaffirming the gods' victory over chaos. Through ritual drama, the community participated in renewing the world itself. Chaos was not eliminated permanently. It was pushed back year after year through repetition. This cyclical understanding of time differed from linear notions of progress. History was not moving toward an end. It was circling around maintenance. Within this framework, knowledge was preserved with reverence. Libraries grew within palaces and temples, storing thousands of tablets covering every aspect of life. Scribes copied older texts faithfully, even when the language was archaic and no longer spoken. Accuracy mattered more than comprehension. The past carried authority precisely because it was old. To alter it casually was to risk destabilizing the present. These libraries also reveal intellectual curiosity. Lists cataloged animals, plants, stones, professions, and stars. Mathematical problems explored abstract relationships. Astronomical records tracked eclipses and planetary cycles over centuries. This accumulation of data suggests a confidence that patterns could be discerned, that chaos was not total. Even the gods followed rules, however inscrutable. The relationship between humans and gods remained transactional but intimate. Offerings were given not out of blind faith, but expectation. The gods were powerful, but they were also dependent. Without temples, rituals, and sustenance, they weakened. This mutual dependence shaped theology. The gods were superior, yet incomplete without human participation. Humanity mattered, not morally but functionally. This belief tempered despair. Suffering was widespread, but existence was not meaningless. Work mattered, ritual mattered, memory mattered. Even death, though bleak in its aftermath, was softened by the hope of being remembered. Names carved into stone or clay could endure beyond the grave. To be forgotten was the true annihilation. Literature from this period reflects this emphasis on endurance rather than salvation. Stories do not promise rescue from mortality. They advise acceptance. Wisdom lies in understanding limits, cultivating relationships, and leaving behind something that persists. The city itself becomes a form of immortality, outlasting generations, carrying the accumulated labor of countless lives. As empires rose and fell, the core structure established after the gods' intervention remained. Cities were destroyed and rebuilt, languages shifted, dynasties ended. Yet the assumptions endured. That order is fragile, that power must be justified, that memory preserves civilization against erasure. The Anunnaki, as conceived in these texts, were not distant myths, but ongoing forces shaping every aspect of life. After they imposed structure on the world, humanity learned to survive within it by balancing obedience with adaptation, fear with ingenuity. Civilization did not eliminate suffering, it organized it. And in that organization, Mesopotamian society found a way to persist across millennia, aware always that beneath the surface of order, chaos waited patiently, as it had before, and would again. Memory became heavier as time deepened. What had once been lived experience hardened into inherited knowledge, passed down through texts, rituals, and institutional habits that shaped thought long before individuals questioned them. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamian civilization had learned not only how to survive catastrophe, but how to remember it as instruction. The past was no longer distant. It was present, embedded in law codes, mythic precedents, and the very layout of cities. Kings increasingly defined themselves through continuity rather than novelty. Rulers traced legitimacy backward, linking their reigns to ancient dynasties, sacred cities, and divine favor established long ago. The Sumerian king list exemplifies this impulse. It recorded rulers stretching back into impossibly long reigns, some lasting thousands of years, blurring the line between gods and men. These numbers were not meant to be taken literally. They compressed dynasties into symbolic lifespans, asserting that kingship itself was ancient, descending from the divine realm rather than emerging from human ambition. This framing mattered politically. It discouraged rebellion by presenting authority as timeless and inevitable. To challenge a king was not merely to oppose a man, but to disrupt an order older than memory. Even conquerors adopted this logic. When Amorite or Babylonian rulers seized power, they did not reject Mesopotamian tradition. They inserted themselves into it, claiming stewardship over a structure they insisted had always existed. Babylon's rise exemplified this adaptation. Originally a minor city, it gained prominence through strategic location, political consolidation, and theological elevation. Its patron god, Marduk, was gradually elevated above older deities. This shift did not erase the Anunnaki. Instead, it reorganized them. Marduk absorbed attributes of Enlil, inheriting authority while preserving continuity. Theology followed politics, offering divine justification for new hierarchies. The Babylonian creation epic reframed cosmic history to reflect this change. Chaos was personified as a primordial sea, defeated by a younger god who imposed structure through violence and intelligence. Humanity was created from the blood of a rebel deity, explaining human restlessness as inherent rather than accidental. This narrative echoed earlier Sumerian ideas but sharpened them, emphasizing obedience and cosmic law under a centralized authority. These myths were not static texts, but living performances. During the New Year festival, priests recited creation stories aloud, reenacting the establishment of order. The king participated humbly, submitting to ritual humiliation to prove his dependence on divine favor. Only after this submission was his authority reaffirmed. Power was renewed annually, not assumed permanently. This cyclical renewal extended to society as a whole. Festivals synchronized agricultural cycles with cosmic myth. Planting and harvest mirrored death and rebirth. Human labor was framed as participation in divine maintenance. This worldview offered coherence in a precarious environment. Even suffering gained meaning as part of a larger pattern rather than random misfortune. Despite this structure, tension persisted between divine order and human experience. Plagues, droughts, and invasions continued. Not every disaster could be ritualized away. When explanations failed, anxiety deepened. Lamentation literature expanded, giving voice to grief that ritual could not fully contain. These texts do not resolve suffering. They articulate it, acknowledging divine silence without abandoning belief entirely. One such lament describes a city abandoned by its god, temples emptied, streets overtaken by weeds. The god's departure is portrayed as both cause and consequence of destruction. This ambiguity reflects a world view that accepts uncertainty. The gods were powerful, but their reasons were opaque. Humans could maintain order, but never guarantee protection. Within households, this uncertainty shaped daily devotion. Amulets were worn. Household gods received offerings alongside great deities. Personal prayers sought protection from illness, misfortune, and betrayal. Religion was not confined to temples. It permeated kitchens, bedrooms, and workshops. Every space was potentially sacred, every action potentially observed. Magic and ritual blended seamlessly with practical knowledge. Incantations accompanied medical treatments. Protective charms were buried beneath doorways. These practices were not considered irrational. They addressed dimensions of existence that material solutions alone could not. The unseen mattered because its effects were felt. Education reinforced these beliefs. Scribal training emphasized obedience to tradition. Students copied texts that preserved ancient spellings and archaic grammar, maintaining continuity across centuries. Creativity was permitted only within accepted frameworks. Innovation without precedent was risky. Stability required restraint. Yet change occurred regardless. Language evolved. New gods entered the pantheon. Political boundaries shifted. The Assyrians rose in the north, building a militarized empire that emphasized dominance through fear. Their kings depicted themselves as instruments of divine wrath, punishing chaos wherever it appeared. Brutality was celebrated openly in reliefs showing defeated enemies flayed or impaled. These images were meant to terrify, but also to reassure. Order was being enforced. Assyrian theology emphasized obedience above all. Rebellion was framed as sacrilege. The gods demanded submission, and the king acted as their enforcer. Yet even this extreme form of control relied on inherited Mesopotamian concepts. The gods still needed temples, rituals, and offerings. The Anunnaki remained foundational, even as their hierarchy was adapted to imperial ideology. The accumulation of texts during this period reached unprecedented scale. Royal libraries collected thousands of tablets, preserving myths, omens, medical treatises, and correspondence. This archival impulse reflected both confidence and fear. Knowledge was power, but it was also fragile. Preserving it became an act of resistance against forgetting. Ironically, destruction ensured preservation. When cities burned, clay tablets baked hard, surviving long after organic materials decayed. Fires that destroyed libraries also sealed their contents for future discovery. Catastrophe once again carried unintended consequences. By the late 1st millennium BCE, Mesopotamian civilization faced new forces. Persian rule introduced different religious concepts, emphasizing moral dualism and cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Greek conquest followed, bringing philosophical abstraction and new political forms. Cuneiform writing gradually fell out of use. The old gods receded, yet the framework endured indirectly. Concepts of law, timekeeping, astronomy, and cosmic order passed into later cultures. Stories of floods, divine councils, and heroic quests echoed in distant traditions. The memory of the Anunnaki faded, but the structures they represented persisted. What defined life after their arrival was not divine presence alone, but the human response to it. Civilization learned to survive by remembering, recording, and ritualizing its own fragility. Order was never assumed. It was constructed daily, enforced through law, myth, and labor. Even as empires collapsed and gods were forgotten, the idea that the world required maintenance, that chaos was always near, remained. In this sense, the legacy of the Anunnaki was not domination, but instruction. They represented forces that demanded structure without guaranteeing mercy. Humanity adapted by building systems that could outlast individuals and absorb loss. Clay tablets replaced memory. Ritual replaced certainty. Civilization became an act of endurance, shaped by the knowledge that the world had once nearly ended and could do so again. As the old gods slowly receded from daily speech, they did not vanish from thought. They remained embedded in assumptions so fundamental they no longer needed to be named. By the time later empires ruled Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki were less often invoked directly, yet the architecture of belief they established still governed how people understood power, fate, and responsibility. Civilization had absorbed its own mythology and begun to operate as if the gods' logic were simply the way reality worked. One of the clearest expressions of this absorption was the changing role of kingship. Early rulers emphasized their service to the gods, portraying themselves as caretakers rather than owners of the city. Over time, kings became more distant, more monumental, depicted in stone reliefs larger than life, towering over enemies and subjects alike. Yet even at the height of royal authority, a king was never fully autonomous. Omens still constrained decisions. Ritual humiliation still reminded him that his power was borrowed. Failure could still be interpreted as divine rejection. This tension produced a distinctive political psychology. Authority was absolute in practice, but fragile in theory. A king could command armies, redistribute land, and impose law, yet his legitimacy rested on forces he could not fully control. This created a culture where compliance was expected, but loyalty was conditional. People obeyed not because rulers were infallible, but because order itself was preferable to the alternative. The alternative was not imagined as revolution or freedom. It was imagined as collapse, flood, famine, invasion, and silence. The memory of cities erased from the landscape shaped every calculation. Even when generations separated people from the last great disaster, its possibility remained vivid. Ruins dotted the plains, mute reminders of what happened when order failed. This awareness shaped ethics. Moral thinking in Mesopotamia was pragmatic rather than idealistic. Texts advised moderation, caution, and self-restraint. Excess was dangerous, whether in wealth, ambition, or speech. Silence could be wisdom. Humility was protection. The gods did not reward virtue consistently, but they punished disruption reliably. Survival favored those who understood limits. Friendship and family took on heightened importance within this worldview. Since the afterlife offered little comfort, meaning was concentrated in relationships and reputation. To be remembered well was a form of continuity. Funerary offerings ensured the dead were not entirely abandoned. Names repeated in prayers and records extended presence beyond death. Oblivion was the true horror. This emphasis on memory reinforced the role of writing. Even as cuneiform declined, the impulse to record persisted. Contracts, correspondence, and chronicles documented events with increasing detail. History became a genre, not yet analytical in the modern sense, but conscious of sequence and consequence. Events were linked, causes inferred, lessons implied. The past mattered because it instructed the present. Literature evolved accordingly. Later epics and wisdom texts reflect a growing introspection. Characters question divine justice more openly. Suffering is acknowledged without immediate explanation. The gods are still powerful, but their motivations are increasingly opaque. Human agency expands, not in defiance of the divine, but in negotiation with uncertainty. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its later form, captures this shift vividly. The hero's quest for immortality fails, not because he is unworthy, but because immortality is not meant for humans. The lesson is not obedience, but acceptance. The walls of the city, built through collective labor, become the true achievement. Civilization itself replaces eternal life as the highest aspiration. This conclusion reflects a maturation of Mesopotamian thought. Early myths focused on creation and control. Later texts focus on endurance and meaning. The gods created the framework, but humans filled it with substance. The city, not heaven, became the locus of value. As external influences increased, this perspective proved adaptable. Persian rulers introduced new ideas about cosmic struggle between truth and deception. Greek thinkers brought abstract philosophy and natural inquiry. Yet these ideas did not erase older assumptions. They layered over them. Order remained central. Law remained sacred. Knowledge remained cumulative. Even monotheistic traditions that later absorbed Mesopotamian narratives retained structural echoes. The flood story persisted, transformed but recognizable. The concept of divine law governing human behavior endured. The image of humanity as caretaker rather than owner of the earth echoed ancient themes. The Anunnaki faded, but their logic survived. What makes this continuity remarkable is its resilience without dogma. Mesopotamian religion lacked a single authoritative text or centralized creed. Beliefs evolved through use rather than decree. Myths changed because society changed. Gods rose and fell with cities. Authority adapted without collapsing entirely. This flexibility allowed survival across millennia of upheaval. At the same time, this system placed heavy demands on individuals. Life was labor-intensive and uncertain. Justice was uneven. Power was often cruel. The gods were not moral guarantors. They enforced order, not fairness. This reality produced a sober outlook, one that valued wisdom over hope and preparation over prayer alone. Education, where available, reinforced this outlook. Students learned proverbs emphasizing restraint, patience, and awareness of risk. Success was attributed as much to timing and favor as to effort. Failure was not always personal. It could be cosmic. This understanding reduced shame, but increased caution. By the time cuneiform ceased to be written, the civilization that invented it had already transformed itself many times. Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Persians each inherited and reshaped the same conceptual framework. The names changed, the rituals evolved, the core concern remained: how to maintain order in a world that resists it. The Anunnaki, in this long view, were never simply characters in stories. They were conceptual anchors, personifications of forces that humans experienced daily: authority, wisdom, fertility, destruction, and renewal. As long as those forces remained relevant, their logic persisted, even when their names were forgotten. Life after their arrival was not marked by divine withdrawal, but by internalization. Humanity learned to carry the burden of order itself, using gods as reference points rather than direct overseers. Civilization became self-sustaining not because chaos disappeared, but because systems were built to absorb it. The ruins scattered across Mesopotamia today testify to both success and failure. Cities endured for centuries, sometimes millennia, before falling. Each collapse reinforced the lesson that nothing was permanent, yet each rebuilding demonstrated that continuity was possible. In this sense, the true inheritance of the Anunnaki was not fear of gods, but awareness of fragility. Civilization survived not by denying vulnerability, but by organizing around it. Memory, law, ritual, and labor formed a lattice strong enough to hold society together, even as individual lives passed quickly. The people who lived within this system did not imagine themselves as the beginning or the end. They understood themselves as participants in an ongoing effort, maintaining what had been established long before and would continue after them. That perspective, more than any specific myth, defined what came after the gods, a civilization that endured by remembering why it must. When the old cities finally began to empty, the silence did not come all at once. It arrived gradually, settling into streets where footsteps once echoed, into canals where water once flowed with purpose. The decline of Mesopotamian civilization was not a single collapse, but a slow unraveling, the result of pressures that accumulated over centuries. Environmental strain, political fragmentation, foreign domination, and cultural transformation combined to loosen the structures that had once held chaos at bay. The rivers remained, but they were no longer carefully managed. Irrigation systems required constant labor, coordination, and authority. When wars disrupted administration or rulers diverted resources elsewhere, canals clogged with silt, fields became waterlogged or saline, turning fertile land into crusted wasteland. Harvests failed not because the gods had departed, but because maintenance had ceased. The ancient balance between human effort and environmental constraint broke down. Urban populations shrank as food became scarce. People drifted toward regions with better conditions or adapted to rural life. Cities that had once dominated trade networks lost relevance as routes shifted. Political centers moved north and west, away from the southern plains where Sumerian civilization had first emerged. With each relocation, memory thinned. Language changed quietly. Sumerian, long preserved as a sacred and scholarly tongue, became increasingly incomprehensible even to scribes. Akkadian, then Aramaic, replaced it in daily use. Writing systems adapted or disappeared. Cuneiform, once the backbone of administration and culture, grew cumbersome compared to alphabetic scripts that required fewer signs and less training. Efficiency favored change. As writing declined, so did the institutional memory it supported. Myths once copied meticulously were summarized, adapted, or forgotten. Rituals simplified. Temples fell into disrepair. The gods did not vanish suddenly, but their presence diminished as fewer people maintained the practices that sustained them. Divine statues were neglected, moved, or destroyed. The intimate relationship between humans and gods weakened. Foreign rule accelerated this process. Persian administration brought different religious priorities, emphasizing moral order and cosmic dualism rather than ritual maintenance. Greek conquest introduced philosophical abstraction and civic models unfamiliar to Mesopotamian tradition. The gods of the old cities were tolerated, sometimes honored, but no longer central. Authority was justified through new narratives, yet the old frameworks did not disappear entirely. They survived in fragments, embedded in customs, laws, and stories that traveled beyond Mesopotamia. The concept of law as divinely sanctioned persisted. The idea of kingship as responsibility rather than ownership endured. The flood narrative spread, reshaped by new theologies but retaining its core structure. Even as temples crumbled, the questions they addressed remained. Why does order fail? Why must humans work endlessly? Why does catastrophe recur? Later cultures offered different answers, but they inherited the problem itself. Mesopotamian civilization had articulated these concerns early, framing them not as moral puzzles, but as conditions of existence. The physical remains of this civilization slowly vanished beneath sand and soil. Mud brick architecture eroded easily, returning to earth. Without continuous occupation, cities dissolved into mounds. Over generations, their names were forgotten. Travelers passed over them unaware, their significance erased from living memory. For nearly 2,000 years, the voices preserved in clay lay silent. The Anunnaki, once central to understanding the world, became unknown. The stories that had shaped civilization faded from collective consciousness. Yet the tablets endured, hidden but intact, waiting for a context that could read them again. When modern excavations uncovered these remnants, the shock was not merely historical. It was conceptual. A civilization thought to be primitive revealed itself as sophisticated, reflective, and deeply concerned with the same questions that preoccupy modern societies. The myths did not read like naive fantasies. They read like attempts to explain systemic vulnerability. The rediscovery forced a reassessment of origins. Civilization did not begin with clarity or optimism. It began with anxiety, with awareness of fragility. Writing emerged not to celebrate triumph, but to prevent loss. Law arose not to enforce morality, but to stabilize relations. Religion developed not to promise salvation, but to negotiate uncertainty. The Anunnaki, in this light, appear less as supernatural beings and more as symbolic representations of forces humans struggled to understand and manage: authority, wisdom, fertility, destruction, time. These forces were given faces and names to make them approachable, arguable, and negotiable. Myth became a language for systems too complex to describe otherwise. What followed their arrival, according to the ancient texts, was not blind obedience but adaptation. Humans learned to work within constraints, to build institutions capable of absorbing shocks. Civilization became a technology of survival, refined through trial and error across centuries. The eventual decline of Mesopotamia does not negate its achievement. It demonstrates the limits of endurance, not its absence. No system can be maintained indefinitely without renewal. The gods required attention. The land required care. When either was neglected, collapse followed. This lesson, embedded in myth and history alike, remains relevant. The ruins remind us that civilization is not self-sustaining. It depends on collective effort, shared belief, and continual maintenance. When these falter, even the most enduring structures dissolve. Yet memory can preserve meaning beyond physical survival. Today, The clay tablets offer a voice from deep time. They speak not of alien visitors or lost technologies, but of human attempts to understand a world that often defied understanding. They reveal a civilization that knew it lived on borrowed time, that order was temporary, and that meaning had to be constructed deliberately. In the end, what survived was not the cities or the gods, but the insight that civilization is an act, not a state. It must be performed continuously, or it ceases to exist. The Anunnaki, as conceived by the Sumerians, did not grant permanence. They imposed structure and walked away. What followed was humanity's long effort to keep that structure from collapsing, an effort that succeeded for thousands of years before finally giving way. The silence that followed was not failure, it was transition. The world moved on, carrying fragments of Mesopotamian thought into new forms. The questions remained, reshaped but unresolved. And in that persistence, the legacy of the Anunnaki endured, not as gods remembered, but as ideas still at work. What lingered after the cities emptied was not belief, but structure. Even stripped of temples and rituals, the Mesopotamian way of organizing reality continued to shape how later cultures understood power, time, and responsibility. The gods no longer needed names to function. Their logic had already been absorbed into systems that operated without conscious reference to divine origin. Law was one of the most durable of these systems. The idea that rules should be written, public, and binding did not disappear with cuneiform. Later, legal traditions inherited the assumption that justice required codification, that authority must be expressed through stable language rather than personal whim. Punishment, once framed as divine balance, became framed as civic necessity. The metaphysical justification faded, but the structure remained intact. Timekeeping followed a similar path. The Mesopotamian division of time into measured units, shaped by astronomical observation, persisted long after the rituals that once accompanied it vanished. Hours divided into 60 minutes, circles measured in 360 degrees, weeks structured around celestial cycles. These were not arbitrary conventions. They were remnants of a world view that treated the sky as an ordered system whose patterns governed life below. Modern clocks still carry this inheritance, silently repeating ancient calculations. Political authority also retained Mesopotamian assumptions. Kingship, even when transformed into emperorship or state governance, continued to emphasize legitimacy over mere force. Rulers justified power through continuity, tradition, and law rather than brute strength alone. The idea that authority must be recognized, not just enforced, traces back to the belief that order descends from something beyond individual ambition. Even when religion shifted toward monotheism, echoes remained. The concept of a divine council became angels. The idea of humanity as caretakers rather than owners of the world persisted. Flood narratives continued to symbolize reset and judgment. These stories did not survive because they were literally believed, but because they expressed anxieties that never disappeared. The flood, in particular, became a recurring metaphor. It represented not only destruction, but excess, the point at which systems fail under their own weight. In Mesopotamian thought, the flood was not moral punishment, it was systemic correction. Later traditions moralized it, but the underlying concern remained the same. What happens when balance is lost? The Epic of Gilgamesh gained renewed relevance precisely because it did not promise transcendence. Its conclusion offered a different kind of permanence, rooted in collective achievement rather than individual escape. The city walls, built through shared labor, became symbols of endurance. This idea resonates strongly in societies that recognize the limits of personal legacy. Institutions, not individuals, carry memory forward. This perspective reframes progress. Advancement is not escape from vulnerability, but refinement of response. Mesopotamian civilization did not imagine a future free of catastrophe. It imagined systems resilient enough to recover. That assumption shaped how infrastructure, law, and ritual were designed. Redundancy mattered. Documentation mattered. Memory mattered. When later empires encountered Mesopotamian ruins, they did not always understand their significance, but they sensed weight. These places felt old, authoritative, foundational. Even conquerors sought to connect themselves to that antiquity. Cyrus of Persia, for example, presented himself as a restorer rather than a destroyer, honoring local customs and gods to legitimize rule. Respect for inherited order proved politically useful. The eventual loss of cuneiform literacy severed direct access to these ideas, but not their influence. Knowledge migrated through translation, adaptation, and absorption. Greek philosophers encountered Mesopotamian astronomy indirectly. Biblical writers reshaped ancient myths within new theological frameworks. Islamic scholars later preserved mathematical and astronomical insights that originated in Babylonian observation. Transmission was uneven, but continuity persisted. What makes Mesopotamian thought distinctive is its lack of illusion. The gods were powerful but fallible. The world was ordered but unstable. Humans were capable but constrained. This realism prevented utopian thinking. There was no final solution, no promised perfection. Only maintenance, vigilance, and acceptance of limits. Modern societies often struggle with this perspective. Progress is imagined as linear, crises as temporary disruptions rather than inherent features. The Mesopotamian record offers a different lesson. Collapse is not abnormal, it is expected. Survival depends not on preventing failure entirely, but on building systems that can absorb it. The Anunnaki, in this sense, represent forces rather than beings. They personified gravity, authority, entropy, creativity, and time. By giving these forces faces and stories, early civilizations made them negotiable. One could argue with a god, appease it, trick it, or mourn its absence. Abstract forces offer no such engagement. As the divine narratives faded, abstraction increased. Forces became laws of nature, economic pressures, political realities. The language changed, but the experience did not. Humans still confront systems larger than themselves, systems that demand labor and impose limits. The ancient response was ritual and myth. The modern response is bureaucracy and theory. Both serve similar functions. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts in the modern era forced a reconsideration of human origins. Civilization did not arise from enlightenment alone, but from fear of loss. Writing was invented to preserve, not to imagine. Law emerged to stabilize, not to idealize. Religion developed to negotiate uncertainty, not to eliminate it. This understanding challenges narratives that portray ancient societies as naive or simplistic. The Sumerians and their successors were deeply analytical within their own framework. They observed patterns, recorded data, debated meaning, and revised stories over time. Their gods evolved because their understanding evolved. Flexibility, not rigidity, sustained longevity. The silence that followed Mesopotamia's decline was not emptiness. It was a pause in transmission. When the tablets were rediscovered, they re-entered conversation not as relics, but as mirrors. They reflected concerns still unresolved: how to organize power, how to live with uncertainty, how to preserve memory against erasure. In the end, what came after the Anunnaki was not their disappearance, but their diffusion. Their logic permeated systems that outlived belief. Civilization continued to operate on principles first articulated in the land between rivers, even when that land itself fell silent. The cities returned to dust. The gods returned to story. The structures remained. And in those structures, the ancient understanding persisted. Order is fragile, memory is essential, and survival depends not on divine perfection, but on human willingness to maintain what has been built, knowing it will never be permanent. Long after the last cuneiform signs were pressed into clay, the logic that produced them continued to shape how people explained the world. The language had vanished, the gods forgotten, but the mental framework endured, reappearing in unexpected places. Civilizations that never heard the names Enlil or Enki nonetheless inherited their functions, reassigning them to abstract principles, natural laws, or singular deities. What once wore many faces learned to speak in fewer names. One of the most significant transformations occurred in how divine authority was imagined. The Mesopotamian gods had been powerful but divided, each embodying a specific force that could conflict with others. Later traditions compressed these roles into unified systems. Authority became centralized, morality emphasized, and cosmic order reframed as intentional design rather than negotiated balance. Yet the older tension remained beneath the surface. Order still required enforcement. Wisdom still moderated power. Compassion still disrupted strict law. This inheritance is visible in the way later cultures struggled with the problem of suffering. Mesopotamian texts never fully resolved it. They accepted suffering as structural, an unavoidable consequence of existence within a fragile system. Later traditions sought moral explanations, attributing suffering to sin, failure, or testing. Yet even these explanations often circled back to the same conclusion. Humans are constrained, the world resists control, and endurance matters more than escape. The flood narrative illustrates this continuity. In Mesopotamian thought, the flood was an overcorrection, a mistake acknowledged by the gods themselves. In later versions, the flood became moral judgment, justified and purposeful. But the emotional core remained unchanged. The destruction was total. Survival was selective. Renewal followed loss. These elements persisted because they matched lived experience. Societies collapse. Some survive. Memory becomes myth. The transformation of these stories reflects changing needs rather than changing realities. As societies grew more hierarchical and centralized, their gods followed suit. A single sovereign deity mirrored a single sovereign ruler. Law became universal rather than localized. Order became absolute rather than negotiated. Yet the practical challenges of maintaining civilization did not disappear. Infrastructure still failed. Power still corrupted. Excess still provoked collapse. Mesopotamian realism offers a counterpoint to narratives of inevitability. Progress was never assumed. Each generation understood itself as temporary, tasked with preserving what had been inherited rather than surpassing it entirely. This humility shaped decision-making. Large projects emphasized durability over novelty. Knowledge was preserved cautiously. Innovation occurred within constraints. Modern societies often reverse this emphasis, valuing disruption and speed. Yet the consequences echo ancient patterns. Systems optimized for efficiency prove fragile. When disruption exceeds tolerance, collapse follows. The Mesopotamian experience suggests that resilience, not expansion, determines longevity. The role of the individual within these systems was also clearly defined. Humans were not expected to transcend their condition. They were expected to fulfill roles competently. Ambition was tempered by awareness of limits. Hubris invited punishment, not because gods were jealous, but because imbalance threatened the system as a whole. This perspective challenges modern assumptions about freedom and self-determination. Mesopotamian thought did not prioritize individual fulfillment over collective stability. Personal desire was secondary to communal survival. The city mattered more than the citizen. Legacy mattered more than pleasure. This prioritization enabled endurance, but at the cost of personal autonomy. Literature from this tradition reflects that trade-off. Characters seek meaning through contribution rather than self-expression. Tragedy arises not from moral failure alone, but from collision between personal desire and structural constraint. These stories resonate because the conflict remains familiar. The Anunnaki, understood symbolically, represent the forces that enforce these constraints. They are the personification of systems that do not care about individual preference: gravity, climate, economy, time. These forces demand adaptation, not negotiation. Ancient people spoke to them as gods. Modern people study them as data. The experience is similar. What distinguishes Mesopotamian civilization is its refusal to deny these forces. Rather than imagining escape, it imagined accommodation. Ritual, law, and memory were tools for coexistence. Civilization was not a triumph over nature, but a contract with it, fragile and renewable only through effort. The disappearance of the old gods did not liberate humanity from these obligations. It removed the language that made them personal. In its place arose abstraction, bureaucracy, and ideology. Systems became less visible but no less demanding. The sense of being subject to forces beyond control persisted, now framed as economic cycles, political necessity, or natural law. Rediscovering Mesopotamian texts offers an opportunity to see these continuities clearly. It reveals that many modern anxieties are not new. Fear of collapse, concern over excess, distrust of unchecked power, and reverence for memory have deep roots. The Anunnaki were not alien rulers or forgotten myths. They were early attempts to articulate realities that remain. Civilization after their arrival did not become stable or just. It became aware. Awareness did not prevent disaster, but it shaped response. When floods came, canals were rebuilt. When cities fell, others rose. When gods failed, stories changed. Adaptation, not perfection, sustained continuity. The final lesson embedded in these ancient texts is neither despair nor hope, but responsibility. Order does not maintain itself. It must be reinforced through collective effort, institutional memory, and willingness to accept limits. When those falter, collapse is not punishment. It is consequence. The Anunnaki fade from view, but the world they described remains. A world governed by systems larger than individuals, demanding work, imposing limits, and offering meaning only through participation. Civilization continues not because it is guaranteed, but because each generation chooses, consciously or not, to maintain it. In this sense, the ancient story does not end. It recurs. Different names, different symbols, the same structure. What came after the Anunnaki was not freedom from gods, but inheritance of their burden. The responsibility to keep order alive, knowing it will never be complete, and that forgetting this truth is the fastest path back to chaos. As centuries layered over one another, the memory of Mesopotamia ceased to function as history and became something closer to instinct. Later civilizations no longer consciously referenced the land between the rivers, yet they operated as if its conclusions had already been accepted. The idea that the world required structure, that disorder was the default state, and that human effort existed primarily to delay collapse had become a silent assumption, carried forward without attribution. This inheritance shaped how people understood work. Labor was not framed as a temporary burden to be overcome through progress, but as a permanent condition of existence. The Sumerian belief that humans were created to work did not survive as myth, but it endured as attitude. Fields still demanded cultivation. Cities still required maintenance. Infrastructure still decayed without attention. The expectation that stability required constant effort persisted long after the gods who demanded it were forgotten. This perspective influenced how societies judged success. Achievement was measured less by personal fulfillment and more by durability. A good ruler left a functioning city. A good family produced descendants who maintained the household. A good generation preserved what it inherited. Innovation was acceptable only when it strengthened continuity. Anything that threatened balance, even if impressive, was viewed with suspicion. The anxiety beneath this worldview never fully disappeared. Natural disasters continued to disrupt order. Political systems rose and fell. Economic cycles produced abundance and scarcity in unpredictable rhythm. Without the language of divine will, people sought other explanations, but the sense of vulnerability remained. The world was not hostile, but it was indifferent. This realization shaped ethics grounded in caution rather than optimism. Religion adapted accordingly. As belief systems moved toward moral absolutism, the older Mesopotamian realism lingered beneath the surface. Even when a single god replaced a pantheon, that god inherited conflicting attributes. Justice and mercy existed in tension. Order demanded sacrifice. Compassion disrupted law. These contradictions mirrored earlier divine conflicts, now internalized within a unified theology. This internalization made the divine less negotiable. Where once humans could appeal to one god against another, now authority was singular. This shift intensified moral pressure. Failure became personal rather than systemic. Yet the underlying reality had not changed. Systems still failed. Excess still produced collapse. The burden simply shifted inward. The loss of ritual maintenance had consequences. Temples once served as centers of redistribution, absorbing surplus and releasing it in times of need. When such institutions disappeared or transformed, societies relied more heavily on markets and state mechanisms. These systems proved powerful but less forgiving. When they failed, recovery was slower, less ritualized, and more chaotic. The Mesopotamian approach to memory offers an alternative model. By embedding history in ritual, myth, and law, It ensured that lessons remained active rather than archived. Each generation reenacted creation, destruction, and renewal symbolically. Forgetting was guarded against deliberately. Modern societies often relegate memory to records rather than practice, making repetition of failure more likely. The decline of cuneiform literacy illustrates this danger. Once the skill disappeared, access to accumulated knowledge vanished with it. Centuries of observation, analysis, and adaptation became inaccessible overnight. Later cultures rebuilt similar insights independently, but at significant cost. The loss demonstrates that progress is not cumulative by default. It requires preservation. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts revealed how much had been lost and how much had been unconsciously retained. Scholars expected primitive superstition and found sophisticated reflection instead. The gods argued. Humans suffered. No one possessed absolute certainty. These texts resonated because they described a condition still recognizable. Modern interpretations that reduce the Anunnaki to aliens or metaphors miss this deeper continuity. The significance of these figures lies not in their literal existence, but in what they represented. The attempt to understand impersonal forces through narrative. By giving structure a face, ancient people made it manageable. By telling stories about chaos, they learned how to resist it. The endurance of flood myths across cultures demonstrates the power of this approach. Floods occur repeatedly in human history, devastating river civilizations worldwide. Each culture explains them differently, but the core experience remains. Total disruption, selective survival, rebuilding with caution. These narratives persist because they encode survival strategies. Mesopotamian civilization formalized this strategy early. It accepted that catastrophe would recur and built institutions accordingly. When those institutions weakened, collapse followed. The lesson is not that collapse can be avoided indefinitely, but that preparation determines outcome. The Anunnaki did not grant humanity control over nature. They represented the acknowledgement that control was limited. Civilization emerged not from mastery, but from negotiation. Water could be guided, not commanded. Land could be cultivated, not owned permanently. Power could be exercised, not guaranteed. This negotiation extended to identity. Individuals understood themselves as temporary participants in a larger process. Their lives mattered, but not more than the systems they supported. This perspective reduced existential anxiety by placing personal mortality within collective continuity. One life ended. The city endured. Modern societies struggle with this balance. Individual meaning is emphasized, often at the expense of shared responsibility. When systems fail, the shock feels unprecedented. The Mesopotamian record suggests otherwise. Failure is not anomaly, it is condition. The question is how societies respond. What followed the gods was not liberation, but inheritance. Humanity inherited the responsibility once attributed to divine maintenance. When gods were believed to walk among humans, order felt external. When they receded, the burden remained. Humans became the custodians of systems they did not fully control. This realization carries both weight and possibility. It means collapse is always possible, but so is recovery. Memory can be preserved, knowledge can be transmitted, structures can be rebuilt. None of these are guaranteed. All require effort. The Anunnaki, then, mark a transition rather than an origin. They represent the moment humans began articulating the forces shaping their existence. What came after was not a departure from those forces, but deeper engagement with them. Civilization learned to speak in law, ritual, and memory instead of myth alone. The silence of the ruins does not signify failure. It signifies completion of one cycle. Others followed, carrying fragments forward. The ancient tablets remain as reminders that the first civilizations were not naive dreamers, but pragmatic thinkers confronting the same uncertainties that persist today. What endures from their world is not belief, but awareness. Awareness that order must be maintained. Awareness that memory is fragile. Awareness that collapse is always near. Civilization continues wherever these truths are acknowledged, whether the gods are named or not. When the ancient world gave way to new empires and new beliefs, the most enduring transformation was not political or religious, but psychological. Humanity no longer experienced order as something imposed directly by visible gods. Instead, order became internalized, embedded in habits, expectations, and institutions that operated even when belief wavered. What had once been maintained through ritual fear now persisted through custom and inertia. This internalization changed how people related to authority. In Mesopotamian cities, obedience had been reinforced by constant reminders of divine presence. Statues watched, omens warned, festivals reenacted creation itself. When these practices faded, authority had to justify itself differently. Written law, bureaucracy, and precedent took on roles once played by gods. The invisible replaced the sacred, but the demand for compliance remained. The consequence was subtle but profound. Power became less personal and more systemic. No longer could misfortune be attributed solely to a god's anger. Responsibility shifted toward administration, governance, and collective decision-making. When famine struck or war erupted, blame increasingly fell on leaders or policies rather than divine whim. This shift did not eliminate anxiety, it redirected it. With this redirection came new forms of control. Record-keeping expanded. Taxation systems grew more complex. Population management became explicit rather than ritualized. Where earlier societies used myth to explain limits, later ones enforced limits through regulation. The effect was similar. Growth was constrained, resources were allocated, stability was prioritized. The Mesopotamian belief that excess invited catastrophe survived in secular form. Economic bubbles replaced divine punishment. Environmental degradation replaced divine withdrawal. Systems still collapsed when stretched beyond tolerance. The language changed, but the outcome did not. Memory, once preserved through ritual repetition, became increasingly archival. Libraries replaced temples as centers of preservation. Knowledge was stored rather than reenacted. This shift made information more portable, but also more vulnerable. Archives could burn. Languages could die. When preservation depended on specialists rather than communal practice, continuity weakened. The loss of cuneiform literacy illustrates this fragility. Once the scribal tradition ended, centuries of accumulated insight became inaccessible. The knowledge was not destroyed immediately. It was abandoned. This abandonment underscores a recurring truth. Preservation requires participation. Without engagement, memory decays regardless of medium. Later civilizations rebuilt similar systems independently. Astronomy, mathematics, law, and medicine re-emerged in different forms. These rediscoveries are often framed as progress, but they also represent recovery of lost ground. The Mesopotamian experience demonstrates that advancement is reversible. Nothing gained is permanent without maintenance. This realization challenges narratives of linear development. History does not move forward uniformly. It oscillates, advances, collapses, and reconfigures. Each civilization inherits fragments of the last, assembling them into new structures that reflect contemporary needs. The Anunnaki disappear, but the problems they addressed persist. The question of meaning becomes central in this context. If order is temporary and collapse inevitable, why maintain anything at all? Mesopotamian texts offer an answer grounded not in hope of permanence, but in commitment to participation. Work mattered because it sustained the present. Ritual mattered because it reinforced connection. Memory mattered because it linked generations. This pragmatic ethic resists both despair and idealism. It accepts limits without surrender. It acknowledges fragility without paralysis. In this sense, Mesopotamian civilization was not pessimistic. It was realistic. It recognized that stability was costly, but preferable to chaos. Modern societies often struggle with this balance. The expectation of continual improvement clashes with environmental limits and social strain. When systems fail, the shock feels existential. Ancient societies expected failure. Their concern was recovery, not prevention alone. This difference in expectation shapes response. The gods once absorbed blame for catastrophe. Their disappearance removed a psychological buffer. Humans now confront the consequences of their actions more directly. Responsibility feels heavier. Yet the underlying challenge remains unchanged: how to live within constraints imposed by forces larger than individual will. The Anunnaki symbolize the moment humans first articulated that challenge. They were not solutions. They were frameworks. Through them, early civilizations externalized pressure, making it visible and narratable. As belief evolved, that pressure moved inward, becoming systemic rather than divine. This shift has implications for identity. Individuals are now expected to navigate complex systems without mythic mediation. Failure feels personal. Success feels temporary. The ancient recognition that no one fully controls outcomes is often forgotten, leading to frustration and blame when systems behave unpredictably. Recovering the Mesopotamian perspective offers corrective insight. It reframes civilization as process rather than achievement. It emphasizes maintenance over conquest, memory over novelty, resilience over perfection. These values are not antiquated. They are urgently relevant. The ruins of Mesopotamia stand as physical evidence of both success and limitation. They demonstrate that complex societies can endure for thousands of years, and that they can still disappear. This duality is not contradiction. It is reality. What followed the Anunnaki was not enlightenment or decline, but maturation. Humanity learned to carry order without constant divine supervision. This autonomy increased responsibility. The gods no longer intervened visibly. Systems had to function on their own. The price of this autonomy is awareness. Without gods to blame or appease, humans face the consequences of neglect directly. Environmental damage accumulates. Inequality destabilizes societies. Memory fades when not preserved deliberately. These are not new problems. They are ancient ones, reframed. The Mesopotamian legacy does not offer comfort. It offers clarity. Civilization exists in tension with entropy. It survives through effort, coordination, and restraint. When those laps collapse follows naturally, not as punishment, but as outcome. In recognizing this, the ancient texts do not diminish humanity. They elevate responsibility. They assert that meaning arises from participation in something larger, even if that something is temporary. The city matters because it holds lives together. Law matters because it regulates conflict. Memory matters because it prevents repetition of failure. The Anunnaki are gone, but the world they described remains. A world where order is fragile, systems are demanding, and survival depends on collective maintenance. Understanding this continuity does not require belief in ancient gods. It requires acknowledgement of ancient insight. What came after was not the end of divine influence, but its translation into human systems. Civilization became its own guardian, inheriting the burden once placed on gods. That burden has not lightened, it has simply changed form. In this sense, the story continues. Each generation repeats the ancient task, maintaining order against inevitable decay. The names change, the structures evolve, the responsibility remains. And in that persistence, the oldest civilization still speaks, not through temples or rituals, but through the enduring truth it first recorded in clay. As the ancient worldview dissolved into abstraction, one of its most enduring legacies revealed itself in how humans learned to fear forgetting more than death. In Mesopotamian thought, extinction was not annihilation of the body alone, but erasure from memory. A person who died but was remembered through offerings, names, and records continued to exist in a diminished yet meaningful way. A person forgotten vanished entirely. This hierarchy of survival shaped how civilizations after Mesopotamia understood legacy. Monuments, inscriptions, and archives emerged as secular replacements for ritual remembrance. Kings carved their names into stone not only to boast, but to persist. Laws were engraved so they could outlive lawmakers. Cities were planned with permanence in mind, even when built from fragile materials. The contradiction was accepted. Nothing lasted forever, but some things lasted longer than flesh. This concern with endurance altered artistic expression. Art was not created for innovation alone, but for recognizability. Forms repeated. Symbols persisted. Change was gradual. Familiarity signaled stability. A motif that survived generations carried authority simply by having endured. This logic influenced later cultures that equated tradition with legitimacy. The same principle shaped education. Knowledge was transmitted through repetition rather than discovery. Students copied texts verbatim, internalizing not only content but structure. Creativity was secondary to accuracy. This approach limited innovation but maximized continuity. The goal was not to surpass ancestors, but to remain connected to them. As societies moved away from divine explanation toward philosophical and scientific frameworks, this reverence for continuity persisted. Scientific models replaced mythic narratives, but they too relied on accumulated knowledge and careful transmission. The idea that truth emerges through record-keeping, comparison, and refinement traces directly back to Mesopotamian scribal culture. Even skepticism inherited this structure. To question was acceptable, but only within a preserved framework. Radical rejection threatened continuity and was therefore suspect. Progress occurred incrementally, layered atop what came before. Sudden transformation was associated with collapse, not advancement. This cautious approach influenced how societies interpreted catastrophe. Disasters were not seen as opportunities for reinvention, but as disruptions to be corrected. Recovery meant restoration rather than replacement. Cities rebuilt on old foundations. Laws reinstated older precedents. Rituals revived ancestral forms. Change was tolerated only when continuity failed entirely. The Anunnaki myths reflect this instinct. Even after the flood, the gods did not create a wholly new world. They modified the existing one. Limits were imposed. Systems adjusted. The framework remained. This pattern became a template for human response to crisis. Adapt without abandoning structure. As belief in the gods waned, the structure persisted independently. Institutions replaced deities as guarantors of order. Courts replaced divine judgment. Archives replaced temples. Yet these institutions demanded the same devotion. Neglect them, and chaos returned. Modern societies often underestimate this demand. Institutions are treated as self-sustaining rather than maintained. When they fail, the reaction is surprise rather than recognition. The Mesopotamian experience suggests that collapse is not evidence of weakness, but of neglect. The loss of ancient knowledge reinforces this lesson. Entire libraries disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because they ceased to be copied. When a generation no longer participates in preservation, continuity ends. Memory requires labor. Without it, even the most sophisticated systems vanish. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts demonstrates the fragility of transmission. What survived did so by accident as much as intention. Fires baked tablets, ruins buried them. Centuries later, chance excavation brought them back into awareness. Survival was not guaranteed. It was contingent. This contingency reframes how civilization is understood. It is not a permanent achievement, but a temporary alignment of effort, memory, and environment. When alignment breaks, civilization dissolves. Another may arise later, but it will not be identical. Each carries fragments of the past, reshaped by new conditions. The Anunnaki, viewed through this lens, are less about origin and more about continuity. They represent the recognition that systems exist beyond individual lifespans. Their authority justified obedience, but their impermanence justified caution. They could fail. They could regret. They could be replaced. This acknowledgement of fallibility distinguishes Mesopotamian thought from later absolutist frameworks. Gods were powerful, but not infallible. Order was real, but negotiable. This openness allowed adaptation. When one god's authority waned, another rose. When one city fell, another took its place. The willingness to adapt without denying continuity enabled longevity. Civilizations that rigidly preserve forms without function collapse under their own weight. Those that abandon form entirely lose coherence. Mesopotamia navigated this balance for millennia. Modern societies inherit this tension, often without awareness. Debates over tradition versus reform echo ancient concerns. How much can change without destabilizing order? How much stability becomes stagnation? These questions are not new. They were embedded in the earliest myths. The flood narrative, again, offers insight. Destruction resets systems, but survivors rebuild using memory. Total erasure benefits no one. Renewal requires continuity. This logic applies beyond myth. It shapes responses to war, economic collapse, and environmental crisis. The persistence of this pattern suggests that the Anunnaki myths tapped into a fundamental human experience. They articulated the reality that systems exceed individuals, that survival depends on participation, and that memory is the thread connecting effort across generations. As civilization grew more complex, this thread became harder to maintain. Specialization fragmented responsibility. No single individual understood the whole system. Dependence increased. When failure occurred, blame diffused. The ancient clarity of shared maintenance faded. Yet the need remained. Infrastructure still required upkeep. Laws still required enforcement. Knowledge still required transmission. When these tasks were neglected, collapse followed predictably. Understanding Mesopotamian thought restores this clarity. It reframes civilization not as a given, but as an ongoing act. It emphasizes that memory is not passive. It must be cultivated deliberately through repetition, education, and shared narrative. The Anunnaki may no longer be worshipped, but their lesson endures. Order is artificial. It must be sustained. Forgetting is the greatest threat, not because it erases the past, but because it removes the guidance that allows rebuilding after inevitable failure. In recognizing this, the ancient worldview offers a form of humility. No system is final. No achievement is permanent. Meaning lies not in permanence, but in participation. Each generation contributes to a structure it will not complete and inherits one it did not create. This perspective does not diminish ambition. It grounds it. It reminds civilization that survival is collective, memory is fragile, and continuity depends on effort rather than belief. These insights, pressed into clay thousands of years ago, remain relevant wherever humans attempt to build order in a world that resists it. What came after the gods was not certainty, but responsibility. The Anunnaki faded, but the burden they represented did not. Civilization learned to carry it forward, imperfectly, repeatedly, and always under the shadow of forgetting. As responsibility replaced reverence, humanity entered a quieter phase of its relationship with order. The gods no longer spoke through omens etched in the sky or voices carried by priests. Instead, their former demands persisted as expectations embedded in systems that appeared neutral, rational, and inevitable. What had once been sacred obligation became social necessity. Order no longer required belief to function. This shift altered how people understood failure. In Mesopotamian myth, catastrophe followed divine decision, even if regretted. In later societies, collapse appeared as mismanagement, error, or coincidence. Yet the experience remained strikingly similar. Crops failed, cities emptied, systems strained and broke. The difference lay in interpretation, not outcome. The absence of visible gods intensified the pressure on human institutions. Where divine will once absorbed uncertainty, now explanations were required. Bureaucracy expanded to fill the gap. Administration replaced ritual. Documentation replaced prayer. These tools proved powerful, but they also demanded constant maintenance. When neglected, they failed as surely as temples once did. This transformation created an illusion of control. Without gods to appease, humans believed they could engineer stability through design alone. Infrastructure grew vast, economies interconnected, populations expanded beyond any ancient scale. For a time, the system appeared self-sustaining. Yet beneath the surface, the same vulnerabilities persisted. Complexity increased fragility. The Mesopotamian worldview offers a lens to understand this fragility. Early civilizations accepted that no system could eliminate risk. They planned for disruption rather than perfection. Redundancy was built into irrigation, storage, and ritual cycles. Modern systems often optimize efficiency at the expense of resilience. When disruption occurs, recovery becomes difficult. This difference reflects a shift in values. Ancient societies prioritized continuity over growth. Modern societies prioritize expansion over stability. The tension between these priorities explains many contemporary crises. Environmental degradation mirrors ancient salinization. Economic collapse echoes ancient debt spirals. Political fragmentation recalls the fall of empires. The gods once personified these pressures, making them visible and narratable. Without them, the forces remain, but less comprehensible. Climate change, market volatility, and systemic inequality lack faces. They resist narrative. This abstraction complicates response, as people struggle to mobilize against forces they cannot see. Mesopotamian myth addressed this challenge by humanizing the inhuman. Storms had tempers, rivers had wills, authority had personalities. These stories did not solve problems, but they framed them in ways that encouraged engagement. Modern discourse often lacks such framing, leading to disengagement or denial. The Anunnaki, understood symbolically, provided a language for complexity. They represented systems that were powerful, necessary, and indifferent. Appeasing them required effort, coordination, and humility. These qualities remain essential, even if the language has changed. As societies grew more individualistic, the collective nature of maintenance weakened. Responsibility fragmented. When everyone depends on systems, but no one feels accountable for them, decay accelerates. The ancient emphasis on communal participation offers a corrective. Order survives when maintenance is shared and visible. Education plays a critical role in this process. Mesopotamian scribal training emphasized continuity and accuracy. Modern education often emphasizes innovation and disruption. Both have value, but imbalance carries risk. Without grounding in inherited knowledge, innovation destabilizes. Without innovation, continuity stagnates. The ancient record demonstrates the danger of losing either. When scribal traditions ended, knowledge vanished. When political systems ossified, collapse followed. Survival required balance. This balance extended to worldview. Mesopotamian thought resisted extremes. Gods were neither purely benevolent nor purely tyrannical. Humans were neither powerless nor sovereign. The world was ordered but unstable. Accepting this complexity allowed adaptation without denial. Modern narratives often seek clarity where none exists. Problems are framed as solvable, crises as temporary. When solutions fail, disillusionment follows. The Mesopotamian acceptance of uncertainty offers an alternative. It does not promise resolution. It emphasizes preparedness. Preparedness shaped ancient architecture, agriculture, and governance. Storage facilities anticipated scarcity. Laws anticipated conflict. Rituals anticipated loss. Modern societies often respond reactively rather than anticipatorily, magnifying damage. The decline of Mesopotamia illustrates the consequences of ignoring these principles. Environmental mismanagement undermined agriculture. Political instability disrupted maintenance. Cultural continuity weakened. Collapse followed not because of a single failure, but because multiple systems failed simultaneously. This pattern recurs throughout history. The Roman Empire, the Maya, medieval states. Each inherited fragments of Mesopotamian logic, applied them imperfectly, and eventually succumbed to similar pressures. Civilization resets, but the challenge remains unchanged. The Anunnaki narrative does not offer prophecy. It offers diagnosis. It identifies the conditions under which order emerges and dissolves. These conditions persist regardless of belief. Understanding this continuity reframes modern anxieties. Fear of collapse is not paranoia. It is historical awareness. The question is not whether systems can fail, but whether societies are prepared to rebuild. Mesopotamian civilization prioritized rebuilding. After floods and invasions, cities were reconstructed, laws reinstated, rituals resumed. Memory guided recovery. Without memory, recovery stalled. The erosion of shared memory in modern societies poses a similar risk. Information overload replaces meaningful preservation. Archives expand while engagement declines. Knowledge exists, but participation wanes. This imbalance threatens continuity. The ancient emphasis on ritualized memory suggests a remedy. Memory must be practiced, not merely stored. Lessons must be reenacted, not just recorded. Values must be embodied, not abstracted. The Anunnaki, as figures of memory, embodied this practice. Their stories were retold, adapted, and lived. They reminded people why order mattered and what happened when it failed. Without such reminders, societies drift. What came after the gods was not enlightenment, but responsibility without narrative. Reintroducing narrative does not require belief in ancient deities. It requires acknowledging the forces they represented and the lessons encoded in their myths. Civilization remains a fragile achievement. It persists through maintenance, memory, and shared responsibility. When these weaken, collapse is not sudden. It is gradual, marked by silence where activity once thrived. The Mesopotamian ruins stand as evidence not of failure, but of effort sustained over millennia. They demonstrate that endurance is possible, but not automatic. Each generation must choose to maintain what it inherits. The Anunnaki no longer demand offerings, but the systems they symbolized still require attention. Ignoring this truth does not free humanity from obligation, it merely obscures it. In recognizing this, the ancient worldview speaks across time. It does not command worship, it demands awareness. Order must be earned continuously. Memory must be preserved deliberately. Civilization survives only as long as people remember why it exists. What follows that recognition is not fear, but clarity. The gods may be silent, but their lesson remains unmistakable. Neglect guarantees collapse, and responsibility, once assumed, cannot be returned. By the time the ancient gods had fully receded into silence, humanity stood alone with systems it barely understood, yet completely depended upon. The transition was not marked by revelation or rupture, but by normalization. What once required divine explanation became accepted as simply how the world worked. Authority existed. Labor was necessary. Collapse was possible. These truths no longer needed myth to justify them. In this normalization, something subtle was lost. When the gods were present, even in flawed and contradictory form, they served as mirrors. Their arguments reflected human conflict. Their mistakes legitimized doubt. Their regret acknowledged limits. When these figures vanished, the mirror disappeared, leaving systems without faces and consequences without narrative. Power became impersonal. Decisions were justified by policy, efficiency, or necessity rather than divine will. This impersonality increased scale but reduced accountability. It became harder to argue with a system than with a god, harder to appeal, harder to humanize. Ancient people could plead with Enki against Enlil. Modern people confront abstractions that do not listen. This shift altered how suffering was experienced. In Mesopotamian myth, suffering had context. It was excessive noise, imbalance, or divine miscalculation. It was tragic but intelligible. In later systems, suffering often appears random or bureaucratic, a side effect of processes too complex to attribute responsibility. This opacity deepens alienation. Yet the ancient insight remains applicable. Systems behave like gods once did. They reward compliance, punish excess, and collapse when overloaded. They are not moral, but functional. They require maintenance, oversight, and restraint. Ignoring this reality does not eliminate it. It magnifies its effects. The Anunnaki myths warned against assuming permanence. Even gods could err. Even cosmic order could fail. This warning is absent from many modern narratives that assume stability as default. Growth is treated as inevitable. Progress is expected. When disruption occurs, it feels exceptional rather than structural. History contradicts this assumption. Every complex society eventually faces limits: resource depletion, environmental strain, political fragmentation. Mesopotamia confronted these challenges early and often. Its myths encoded survival strategies: diversification, storage, redistribution, and ritualized humility. These strategies were imperfect, but they extended longevity. Modern societies possess greater technological capacity, but often lack comparable humility. The belief in control encourages risk-taking beyond sustainable limits. When failure occurs, recovery is complicated by scale and interdependence. The ancient focus on resilience rather than dominance offers a corrective. Resilience requires redundancy. It requires memory. It requires willingness to accept limits. These principles are not intuitive in cultures that celebrate disruption and speed. They must be taught deliberately. Mesopotamian civilization taught them through myth. The flood story, stripped of literal interpretation, remains instructive. Excess leads to collapse. Survival depends on foresight. Rebuilding requires cooperation. These lessons apply equally to environmental crisis, economic collapse, and social fragmentation. The language may change, but the pattern persists. The final gift of the Anunnaki was not civilization itself, but awareness of its cost. Civilization demands labor. It demands restraint. It demands maintenance. It offers security, but not certainty. This trade-off is unavoidable. Pretending otherwise invites disaster. As the ancient world faded, this awareness dispersed into fragments. Some cultures preserved it through tradition. Others forgot and relearned it through collapse. The cycle repeated. The rediscovery of Mesopotamian texts in modern times reintroduced this awareness explicitly. They revealed a civilization that understood fragility deeply and structured life accordingly. They did not romanticize the past. They documented struggle without consolation. Reading these texts today is unsettling precisely because they feel familiar. The gods argue like institutions. The floods resemble systemic collapse. The survivors rebuild with caution and memory. Nothing about this pattern is obsolete. The Anunnaki do not offer salvation. They offer perspective. They remind humanity that order is constructed, not guaranteed. That memory is defense against repetition. That humility extends survival. As civilization moves forward, the temptation to dismiss ancient insight grows. Technology creates distance from history. Comfort dulls awareness of fragility. Yet the underlying conditions remain unchanged. Water still floods. Land still degrades. Systems still fail. What differs is scale. Modern systems affect billions rather than thousands. Collapse propagates faster. Recovery takes longer. The ancient warning is therefore more relevant, not less. The gods are gone, but the responsibility they represented has not vanished. It has intensified. Humanity now governs systems once attributed to divine control: climate, population, infrastructure. The stakes are higher, the margin for error narrower. In this context, remembering Mesopotamia is not an academic exercise. It is practical instruction. It demonstrates how long civilization can endure when it respects limits, and how quickly it collapses when it forgets them. The Anunnaki myth ends not with triumph, but with continuation. Humans inherit the world, imperfect and unstable. They are allowed to proceed, but not without consequence. This ending resists closure. It insists on responsibility. What comes after is always provisional. Each generation rebuilds, reinterprets, and repeats the ancient task. The names change, the systems evolve, the obligation persists. The silence of the gods does not signify absence, it signifies transfer. Authority has moved from myth to mechanism. Meaning has shifted from ritual to practice. Order survives only through deliberate action. Understanding this transfer is the final lesson embedded in the clay tablets. Civilization is not a gift that can be kept untouched. It is a process that demands engagement. When engagement wanes, collapse follows. The Anunnaki fade into story, but their function remains. They were never simply beings to worship. They were reminders that power without restraint destroys itself, that systems without maintenance decay, and that memory is the thin line separating continuity from oblivion. What came after them was not freedom, but stewardship. Humanity inherited a world that resists permanence. Whether that inheritance is preserved or squandered depends not on belief, but on willingness to remember why order exists and what it costs to maintain it. At the far edge of memory, where names dissolve and stories lose their endings, one truth remains intact. Civilization is not a destination reached once and secured forever. It is a condition maintained moment by moment, generation by generation, through choices that rarely feel dramatic while they are being made. The people who first pressed signs into clay understood this instinctively. They did not believe they were building the future. They believed they were preventing disappearance. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the oldest texts, were never meant to be comforting figures. They were powerful, inconsistent, sometimes cruel, sometimes protective, and always demanding. They reflected the forces that shaped human existence long before humans had the language to describe systems or ecology or economics. By giving these forces form, early civilizations learned how to live beside them rather than be crushed beneath them. What followed their arrival was not divine order imposed once and completed. It was a prolonged negotiation between structure and collapse. Humanity learned to organize labor, channel water, record memory, enforce law, and distribute resources, all while knowing none of these achievements were permanent. That knowledge did not weaken civilization, it hardened it. When the gods faded from worship, the negotiation did not end. It simply lost its mythic language. The same pressures persisted, now expressed through institutions, markets, governments, and technologies that operate without faces or voices. The absence of gods did not remove obligation. It intensified it. Modern civilization often behaves as though order is self-generating, as though complexity guarantees stability. The ancient record offers a quieter, harsher lesson. Complexity multiplies points of failure. Stability must be practiced. Maintenance is not optional. Forgetting is fatal, not immediately, but inevitably. The ruins of Mesopotamia do not accuse. They instruct. They show what endurance looks like when achieved through restraint rather than domination. They show how long a society can persist when it accepts limits rather than denies them. They also show how quickly that persistence ends when attention shifts elsewhere. The disappearance of the old cities was not punishment, it was consequence. Irrigation failed, trade shifted, political authority fractured, cultural memory weakened. Each failure alone was survivable. Together, they overwhelmed the system. Collapse was not sudden. It was cumulative. This pattern repeats because it is structural, not cultural. Every civilization faces the same constraints, regardless of belief or technology. Resources are finite. Environments respond to use. Human coordination is imperfect. Time erodes all constructions. No ideology alters these conditions. Only awareness mitigates them. The Anunnaki myths preserved that awareness by embedding it in narrative. They reminded people that even the most powerful forces could err, that excess provoked correction, and that survival depended on listening, adapting, and remembering. Without those reminders, societies drift toward assumptions of permanence that history never supports. What endures from Mesopotamia is not theology, but posture, a posture of vigilance, a posture of humility, a posture that treats order as fragile and worth defending. These attitudes are transferable, independent of belief, relevant wherever humans gather into complex systems. The final irony is that the Anunnaki succeeded most fully after they were forgotten. Their logic became invisible, embedded so deeply in civilization that it no longer required myth to operate. Yet invisibility carries risk. What is unseen is often neglected. Recovering the ancient perspective does not mean reviving old gods. It means recovering respect for maintenance, memory, and limits. It means understanding that collapse is not aberration, but baseline, held at bay through effort. It means accepting that responsibility does not end when belief does. The clay tablets survived because people believed memory mattered more than convenience. They copied texts they barely understood because continuity mattered more than novelty. That choice extended civilization across millennia. When the copying stopped, so did continuity. Every age decides what it will preserve. Every age decides what it will forget. These decisions shape not only culture, but survival. The Anunnaki narrative insists on this point relentlessly. Forgetting invites chaos. Remembering enables rebuilding. At the end of the story, humanity is not rewarded with certainty or peace. It is allowed to continue. That permission is conditional, renewed through effort rather than granted once. The gods withdraw, not because they are satisfied, but because the task has been transferred. What comes after is stewardship without spectacle, work without guarantees, order without assurance. This is not a tragic ending. It is a realistic one. The first civilizations did not imagine themselves as masters of the world. They imagined themselves as caretakers, standing between chaos and continuity. That self-conception allowed them to endure far longer than many societies that followed. The lesson they left behind is simple and difficult. Civilization survives not through belief in progress, but through commitment to maintenance. Not through denial of limits, but through respect for them. Not through certainty, but through memory. The Anunnaki are silent now. Their temples are ruins. Their names are footnotes. Yet the world they described still behaves exactly as they warned it would. Systems strain. Excess corrects itself. Collapse follows neglect. Renewal follows effort. In that sense, nothing has ended. The ancient story continues without its characters, carried forward by every society that chooses to remember why order exists and what it costs to sustain it. What came after the Anunnaki was not the absence of gods, but the presence of responsibility. And that responsibility, once assumed, has never truly been relinquished.